First off, I should start the recording. One of the arguments that I made in our last discussion is that there is this property called emergence that we see across a wide variety of subject material. We can talk about it in psychology and sociology. We can talk about it in physics and chemistry, whereby we observe that when you put a bunch of parts together, what those parts are capable of is more than any of those individual parts are capable of. So that is, it's kind of the old saying, the sum is the whole is more than just the sum of its parts. That is what emergence is. So any entity that is observed to have properties that its parts do not have on their own. So I made the argument that atoms behave this way, such that if you have a sodium ion and you have a chlorine ion, each of those are poisonous in and of themselves. You put them together, you get an entirely new compound that is salt, that has properties that neither sodium nor chlorine have on their own. Ants are the same way. Alone, ants are capable of certain things, but you put them together, they create a colony. They are capable of much more, of accomplishing more as a group than they are alone. And the same is true of people. People are capable of many spectacular things on their own, by their lonesome. You put them together though, and we can create societies, really complex cooperative groups that are capable of doing far more than any individual could by themselves. And so the idea is that with neurons, the same thing is true. Neurons can transmit information from one location to another, but you put them together and you get a system. You get the nervous system, which is capable of doing far more than any one of those individual neurons can. So perception, my argument was, is an emergent product. It's an emergent property of sensory processing, of what our nervous system is designed to do. So when we say that our brain interprets sensation, what we're saying is that we're taking in information from the outside world, this sensory information, and something is emerging from that. And that is what our perception is. Okay, well, now that we know a bit about perception, I want to close the loop here. I want to make this crystal clear. So if sensation and perception on the whole is how your brain receives sensory information, how it picks up on sight, smell, taste, etc., and then interprets it. Well, this part of interpreting lies on a set of what are called assumptions. And what we went over this past week were really just a bunch of different assumptions that your brain makes when it's trying to organize the information that it takes in through sensation. So we're working with a set of assumptions. We started by describing size, shape, and color constancies. These are each types of assumptions, right? So when I have a bottle in front of you and I put it closer to the camera, on your retina, in your eyes, how the light is entering and actually being represented on your retina, the bottle gets larger. It looks like it's bigger. But your brain doesn't assume that. That's not really what your brain assumes, is that, well, okay, this bottle, yes, is appearing larger, but I know that the size is staying the same. The thing that's actually changing is the distance between this bottle and the camera. So that is size constancy. The brain assumes that nothing fundamentally changes about the bottle. Shape is also a constancy. If I show you this phone and it's a square, what I can do is then I can reorient it such that it looks more like a line. Technically, it's still a rectangle, rather than a square. It's still a rectangle, but it appears more like a line. You know that nothing has fundamentally changed about the phone. The only thing that has happened is the orientation has changed. So again, your brain assumes that size and shape and color are constants. When you assume they are constants, that allows your brain to say, if this changes, the only change must be due to how it where it's positioned within space, how close it is, how it's oriented, etc. Those are assumptions that your brain makes. And so linear perspective is another assumption. Looking at this drawing on the right side, you see a railroad, and it looks like the railroad is extending into the distance. By looking at this photo, your brain interprets this as having 3 dimensions. That is, that there is depth to this photo. And the major cue to that is linear perspective. That is, those 2 parallel lines that make up the tracks. As they meet at the top, it looks like, as they extend forward, those parallel lines begin to meet at the top. Because those lines begin to meet, your brain interprets that and says, anything that seems to converge at a certain point looks like it must extend into the distance. Therefore, if I see 2 lines, the assumption is, if I see 2 lines converge, there must be depth there. Same with these power lines. The power lines seem to get smaller and smaller and smaller. Because of size constancy, your brain's going to assume, well, the power lines are not going to get smaller. Those stay the same shape. So if they are getting smaller, it must be because there's greater distance between me and the power line. So again, your brain, from that assumption, says there must be depth. This must be 3 dimensions. That is how your brain perceives things. Essentially, these assumptions are baked into our brain. We are equipped with them. We really come into the world with a lot of these assumptions already pre-programmed into our brain. And then there are many others that we learn through experience. And we build those assumptions. So then what we can argue is that the brain organizes sensory information. It organizes sight and sound and smell and taste and touch by using these built-in assumptions to make predictions about the future. If you were to see an image like this, if you were to see that there is a set of train tracks and it seems to extend into the distance, there are a couple of things that you could predict. You could predict that you could walk along this railroad and actually travel that distance. You might predict that because it's in the distance, a train could appear and actually start rolling down those railroad tracks. So it's important for your brain to organize this information so that it can use it to then predict what's about to happen. Can I walk down this railroad track or road? Is a train going to come and I need to get to safety? We're making predictions about how something's going to be. All right, to really solidify this, I want to show you an image. Remember, if we're trying to predict how an image will finish, this can help us explain certain types of illusions. So I'm just going to give you a second to kind of take this image in. When you first look at this, it kind of makes sense. You're like, oh, there's a dog and it's holding something. Then you realize something's off and the body isn't quite lined up. Well, here's what your mind is doing. When you first see this image, what you look at is usually the face of the dog. It's usually the most complex. Our eyes are drawn to faces. So you see the head, you see the feet, and what your brain is going to do before you even look on the right side of the image, your brain's going to go, oh, it's a dog head. If I were to follow from the dog head to the back of the dog, I should see a back there. Because 100% of the time, whenever I have seen a dog, it has both a head and it has a back end. So what your brain tries to do is it tries to take the information of its face, of its head, and then it tries to fill in the rest. It makes a prediction. There will be a back end too. So if you look at this and you see the front end, immediately for a second you might say, oh yeah, it's just a wiener dog. It's a hot dog, right? And then you trace it back and you go, oh no, there's something wrong here. What your brain is doing is it first actually completes the image for you. It makes you see the dog as whole. Then as you stare at it long enough, that's when you realize, wait a second, the back end doesn't line up with the head. So at first, your brain tries to predict how the dog is going to end. Then you realize, oh, the end and the front are off. That's what gives this illusion. That's why if you kind of sit back and you just kind of look at it, you can kind of, for just brief seconds at a time, you can kind of see the dog as complete, right? You can kind of see that the front end matches up with the back end. That's your brain continually trying to go, oh geez, this should be a complete dog. I should see the head connected to the tail. That's a built-in assumption. Every time you've ever seen a dog, it has been complete. Therefore, you should always assume that if you see a head, it's going to have a tail. I like this image a lot. All right. Hopefully that makes sense. Your brain is using assumptions to organize sensory information and make predictions. That is what perception is. That is the emergent property. The emergent property is, what do you get when you combine sensory information with the assumptions of your that your brain makes? What is the output? What is created? Okay. So here's a point that I want to make. This is a new point. Your brain, the way that it interprets sensory information, the point is to assist survival. The reason you have a nervous system, remember, its main job is to transmit information, make sense of information, and predict the future. Well, the only real reason that you or any other organism would have a nervous system is if somehow it helped you as a biological organism. Because that's what we are. We're biological organisms attempting to constantly avoid death and to reproduce. That's what we're basically designed to do. So what your nervous system, by trying to predict the future, it might try to predict danger. It might try to predict that something will happen in the future that could very well have a huge impact on whether you survive and maybe what opportunities you have to reproduce. So here's the argument. Your nervous system has been gradually shaped through natural selection to perceive the world in a way that is useful, to perceive the world in a way that's going to help you to survive. However, and here's the important point, just because it helps you to survive does not necessarily mean that it's accurate. So your perception of the world might be useful, it might help you to survive, but that doesn't mean that it's accurate. So let me give you an example of that. I've used the example before of I've used this several times. You're walking through the woods. There's a bush next to you. It starts to rustle, and you have a decision in that moment. Your decision, you need to figure out whether that's something that's harmful. There's a predator in that bush that could kill you, or whether it's just the wind. It's something, it's the bush rustling. There's nothing in there. Well, what your nervous system does by default is that it at least pays attention to it. You monitor that bush, and if you don't start to back away immediately, you at least try to figure out what's going on there, right? The default response of your nervous system is assume that something's in the bush. Because if you assume that something's in that bush, then it's at least going to motivate you to check it out. If you assume that there's nothing in that bush, then you just keep on walking, and if there is something there, it can kill you. So the default assumption is if a bush is moving, if something is moving around you, assume that there is something alive there. Assume that there is something living that you might need to actually check out and be like, wait, is there something over there? Do I need to check that out? That's one of the assumptions that your brain makes. Assume that something animate is there, something with its own mind is there that potentially could harm you. Because if you make that assumption, you'll be more likely to survive. However, just because you think that there might be something there doesn't mean there actually is. It's possible that there's nothing in that bush. So again, your perception is just going to be what is useful to you, but it may not necessarily be accurate. So the summary of that is how your brain interprets information need not match reality as long as it enhances survival. This is a really important part, an important point to take away as we move forward, because I think you'll see that whenever perception, whenever what you think is true is mismatched to what actually is true, it can very often be explained as, would it be useful for you to perceive something as true, even if it weren't? All right, I'm going to put these articles up here. I encourage you to take a screenshot of these and then maybe look them up in your own time, spend some time reading through them. Everything that I've just explained to you, I think, is very well written and well argued in this particular article. This article argues that your nervous system, its basic function, is to optimize survival, is to help guide you and help you to avoid things that could potentially kill you. Let me just read a few quotes here. So we first proposed that the goal of the nervous system is to reduce surprise and optimize actions by first predicting the sensory landscape by simulating possible encounters with threat and selecting the appropriate pre-encounter action. So in other words, your nervous system first tries to simulate if something happens and it's surprising. First, try to simulate what it could be, right? That is what you're doing when you're walking along and you see a bush rustle and you are surprised. You start to simulate the possibilities. You start to predict the future. You start to go, is this an animal? Is something in there? And so you look and you try to look for other bits of movement. You try to see if you can see a tail, if you can see, a head popping out or eyes. What you do is you try to simulate what might happen. And you search for information. And then you engage in prevention strategies in which the organism manufactures safe environments. You start to back away. You start to put some distance between you and what might potentially be threatening to you, or at least you stop moving in that direction. All right. So this is again, really useful perspective. If you search for the title of this article in Google Scholar, I don't know if anyone uses Google Scholar. It's a very good resource for finding. What Google Scholar does is if you Google something, normally you get hits from all over the internet. In Google Scholar, you will only get returns. It'll only search for stuff within peer-reviewed scientific journals. Well, not necessarily scientific, but peer-reviewed journals, peer-reviewed academic journals. So if you search for this in Google Scholar, you'll find this. I believe this is open access. You can read this at your leisure. The second claim that I made was that your perception does not necessarily have to be true. It just has to be useful. This article does a good job of explaining that. That is the idea that natural selection, evolution by natural selection, has actually shaped our nervous system to generate beliefs, generate thoughts that are useful to us, that'll help us to survive, and not necessarily beliefs that are true. So that is, natural selection has actually shaped our nervous system to potentially create what are called non-veridical perceptions, non-truthful perceptions or beliefs that you very dearly hold as true that are not necessarily true because they helped you to survive. So I suggest taking a screenshot of this as well, finding it on your own time. Take some time to think about it. In short, if you don't have time to read these articles, Again, perception need not match reality. Let's bring that back to what we know. We've learned about authority bias and we've learned about confirmation bias. Remember that authority bias is when authority says something or tells you something, you assume, or you're more likely to assume, that what they say is true. And again, that makes sense because authorities tend to have expertise. They may often tend to be older and therefore they have more experiences. And so people with experience and people with expertise do tend to be more correct than, say, the common Joe, right? So you should, to some degree, it's helpful to you. It assists your survival, your ability to function in the world, to assume that authorities tend to be right. The problem is authorities can be wrong. So what an authority says is true may not match what is actually true. And so this sets up the possibility for your perception to not match reality. You may believe an authority when in fact what they tell you to believe is not true. Same with confirmation bias. Confirmation bias was that tendency to find and remember information that is already consistent with what you believe. So for example, if you go on the internet and you Google, are vaccines safe? You're going to get a lot of hits. You're going to get a lot of different sites saying, no, they're perfectly safe. No, they've got, a lot of potential harms. What you're likely to do is, depending on what you currently believe, you are likely to focus on and remember the articles that already confirm what you believe. So if you believe that vaccines are safe, you are more likely to click on and remember those articles, and vice versa if you think that they're unsafe. Rather than, and this is the alternative is you read a lot of those different articles, figure out the perspective of each side, and then try to piece apart whether some of it makes sense and some of it doesn't. That's what we should do, right? Rather than just keeping ourselves reading the same material that already confirms what we believe. So what you focus on is not necessarily the whole truth. What you focus on is not necessarily what is reality or what is true. However, it might be helpful to have your beliefs conform to what you to focus on things that already confirm what you believe. I had a student in my last class ask, well, how does this help survival? How does this, what does confirmation bias do for us? It seems like it seems like a big loophole, right? There are actually a lot of potential explanations for this, but one explanation that I've heard that I don't know how much support it has, but that it's, in my mind, it makes sense, is it can be very often helpful to believe, to find information that supports what you currently believe, if that belief is shared by a bunch of other people around you, if it's shared within a group. One of the things that we know about belief is when within a group of people, everyone shares the same belief, it makes it easier for that group to coordinate. It makes it easier for that group to together work towards a common goal. If everyone believes the same thing, they are all pretty much going to think that there's the same solution to a problem and they can work towards it together. But if people disagree, if people are, have different ideas, different beliefs, then how quickly you get to that solution, how quickly you get to that goal that you're striving for as a group, it tends to be a lot slower. So the idea is we might actually have this assumption built into our brain of, if you already believe something, and especially if the people around you also believe that thing, just focus on the information that supports what you believe, so that together you all kind of buy into the same thing and you can all coordinate better. That might help your survival, right? If your group is stronger, if everyone believes the same thing and you're able to get stuff done more effectively, that's going to aid you personally. However, that doesn't mean that what the group believes, what everyone believes and what you believe is actually true. It just means that believing it together, everyone believing it, happens to advantage you. I hope that distinction is clear. That what you perceive may simply be useful for you to perceive, rather than it actually being truthful, rather than it matching reality. All right, one more example in case that really didn't land yet. There's another bias I want to introduce you to. This is called availability bias. This is the tendency for people to overestimate the likelihood of an event if they've had a personal experience with it. So that is, if you have personally experienced something in the past, you have a memory of it, you've built up that kind of, you've stored information about it, you're more likely to think that that thing will happen again. So for example, if anyone has ever been in a car crash, or anyone has ever, had, we can talk about this with really any traumatic experience. You're in a car crash. It's not a good experience for one reason or another. The next time you get into a car, you might actually be exceptionally more careful, right? You start to think, okay, I've been in a car crash once, therefore I might get into it again. And you might literally think, I am likely to get into a car crash again. If you go and you look at national statistics, which do exist, you can figure out what your chance of getting into a car crash is. But if you've had that experience previously, you're more likely to think that your chance of getting into a car crash is much higher than the national average. So you're likely to overestimate how likely an event is if you've had personal experience with it. Another example with availability bias. I don't know how many of you keep up with kind of recent and continuing trends in people's romantic lives. I teach a class on human sexuality, so I talk about this a little bit in my class. The idea of consensual non-monogamy. That's stuff like polyamory and swinging and open relationships, where partners agree, they're open about it. They talk with one another about the possibility of having sex with or forming romantic, intimate connections with other people. That is, you're forming relationships with more than just one individual. And not only that, everyone's on board, everyone understands, everyone consents to it, they agree to it. Well, there's been research coming out about these kinds of relationships, and what we find is that these relationships on average actually tend to function totally fine, as well as a monogamous relationship would. So monogamy would be exclusively between two people. One person is with one other person and they don't let anyone else in their relationship. They don't mess with anyone else. They're exclusive. We find that under the right circumstances, consensual non-monogamy can actually lead to perfectly fine relationship outcomes on average equal to monogamy in terms of relationship satisfaction and quality. However, if you ask people, how do you feel about consensual non-monogamy? A lot of people might, I'm not making this up, I'm not pulling this out of my ass, they've actually done this kind of study, and they find that the vast majority of people go, see, I don't think that those relationships are going to be as high quality. I don't think that partners can really trust each other in these relationships. I don't think that, I think they're more likely to fall apart, stuff like that. And one of the questions that I'm personally trying to ask in some of my research is, well, let's imagine that you've had a previous experience with non-monogamy, with, say, you or your partner being involved with more than one person. If you've been cheated on previously, that is, you were in an exclusive relationship, your partner then went off behind your back without your consent, without telling you about it, and then had sex with someone else or started to kind of flirt and form an intimate attachment with someone else. Are you, if you've had that experience, more likely to have a negative attitude towards consensual non-monogamy? That is, if you've had a poor experience with non-monogamy, do you then assume that anyone who gets involved in a consensually non-monogamous relationship will also have a poor experience? The question here is, are non-monogamous experiences bad? Are they universally negative for everyone? Or have your experiences with it been bad, and therefore you assume that negative things are more likely to happen in a consensually non-monogamous relationship compared to a monogamous one? Is it because of availability bias, or is it because these relationships are genuinely worse off? We don't know. It's actually one of the questions I'm trying to answer. So I'll let you know if I have an answer to that sometime. But my guess is that people who have had experiences with cheating are more likely to have negative opinions about consensual non-monogamy. So again, based on your previous experience, your perception of how something might turn out, the perception of the quality of a relationship might depend on your personal experience. So your perception does not match reality. It simply matches what might be useful to you. Maybe you're not well equipped to make one of these relationships work. It's useful to you, but not necessarily truthful. All right, I've talked a lot, but there's a lot of interesting stuff here. And so here I kind of want to open this up, and I just want to ask, now that you've heard my argument here, first off, do you understand it? And secondly, are there any other instances where your perception might not match reality? Have you thought of any examples during this time?
So I have an example with availability bias, I think. So the other day I was in the I was working on my med-surg unit, and we got a patient from the ER, and she was having a reaction to the COVID vaccine. Her throat, I think it was an allergic reaction, but her throat was clenching up, and she had a seizure right whenever she got to the floor. We had to do a rapid response on her. And afterwards, she was like, I'm never getting a shot again. I was just trying to be safe. So availability bias probably would come into it because they think the likelihood of an event would happen again. So yeah.
Yes, no, I think that's perfect. That's an excellent example, right? Is especially with medical procedures. That is really, it's kind of, if you're going to assume anything, people are naturally probably going to assume that the worst will happen. Because if you assume that the worst will happen, that kind of prepares that prepares you against that worst scenario. So yes, if you have a medical procedure of any type, we could talk about a vaccine, we could talk about getting surgery, and maybe the surgery doesn't go as well as you thought it would. Any kind of medical intervention, if you have a negative experience with it, from there on out, even if the true probability is quite low that you experience any problem with it, if you personally have had that experience, that is what is available to you, you're more likely to think that your chance of having that experience again is much higher than it might actually be. Yes, that would be availability bias. That would be that's a great example. Yes. Other examples or any comments on this, even if you don't have an example? Do you buy into this logic that your perception is something that exists to help you, but it might be mismatched to reality? That is, just because you believe something, just because you think something's true, and even if most other people believe it, it could be wrong. It could not be matched to reality. Yeah, go ahead, Hope.
I was gonna say, I feel like perceptions are really like a nitpicky thing. I feel like everyone has their own opinions on everything, and some people can be very like close-minded, depending on the situation.
Yeah. So how do you feel that kind of, how does closed-mindedness and open-mindedness maybe factor into all of this? What are your thoughts there? Yeah.
Well, if you're open-minded, you would listen to what someone else has to say and just think about it from that view and from other different perspectives. And when you're closed-minded, you're just kind of like, okay, this is my standpoint. That's it. I'm right.
Yeah. It's almost, open-mindedness is a funny thing because um, it seems like it's actually something that you want to be in many situations where, let's say that you, for most of your life, believe a certain thing, like very, very solidly. And if you keep an open mind, what that protects you against is the possibility that if what you believe is actually untrue or it's incomplete in some way, which is usually more the case, it's incomplete, right? There may be a grain of truth, but it's really not the whole truth. What it does is it opens you up to potentially readjusting your perception of something such that it does match reality more, right? If you're open-minded, let's say that you say travel to other places, you talk with people who you wouldn't normally talk with, you try to expose yourself to ideas that you're uncomfortable with. What that allows you to do is kind of compare the beliefs that you hold, the perceptions that you have, with other people's perceptions, with other people's beliefs. And from there, maybe you can kind of work towards and kind of figure out, wait, actually, what I believe has these holes in it, or this doesn't make sense. And so you can update your belief based on that new information. I think that's one of the strengths of being open-minded. Now, because I love playing devil's advocate, I'll also say this. I think there are strengths, potential strengths, although many, many limitations, to being closed-minded as well. Because let's say that whatever your perception is truly helpful to you in some way. And so if you were open-minded and your belief changed in a way that maybe matched reality better, but that ended up being worse for you, you might actually be motivated to have a closed mind, right? It might actually serve your best interests to not open yourself up to other people. It might be very selfish for you to do that. But in terms of just, survival and you doing what's best for you, sometimes being closed-minded can kind of keep you safe, right? Even if it's not what's best for you in the long term, potentially. I think that's the allure of being closed-minded. I think there's actually some amount of research showing that closed-mindedness tends to be associated with actual emotional and physiological responses that keep you away from something. So things like disgust, the emotion of disgust, its purpose is to keep you away from something. If you find something disgusting, you go, oh, I don't want to be near that. I might catch something from that. I might get something that I don't want to pick up. Well, that's very similar to closed-mindedness, right? Is if you don't keep your mind open to new things, if that new thing is harmful to you, then you won't pick it up. So I think that there's that allure of closed-mindedness, but I actually I tend to think that we can take precautions against picking up bad ideas, and so I think on average it's a good idea to be more open-minded than closed-minded, so that if you are wrong about something, if you are believing something that might actually be harmful to you or harmful to other people, it's important for you to know otherwise. Great point. Thanks for bringing that up. All right, other thoughts on this before we move on?
Could authority bias be like, you remember whenever you were talking about the chicken noodle soup and ginger ale or Sprite? Could that be like authority bias? Because, whenever you're sick, your parents would make you chicken noodle soup and Sprite because they told you that'll make you feel better when it couldn't it can't always be true because you could be at that point in a sickness where you're about to overcome, like your immune system has beat the cold or virus or whatever.
Yes, that is precisely it. Yep. That closes a loop. Thank you for that. That's exactly what I argued back then. That's what I'm arguing now. Is yes, authority bias works in that way. Is that you might do something and believe that it works, even though in reality it might not. In the case of chicken noodle soup, I imagine it depends. If you are malnourished, you just don't have any food in you, eating chicken noodle soup is probably going to help you because it's food. However, if you are already overburdened with salts and fats, chicken noodle soup is salty and fatty. What you might actually need is maybe more vegetables. So maybe eating a salad while you're sick might be better than eating soup, depending on the situation. So should you just default to soup every time? Should you maybe consider soup? Yeah. Should you default to soup every time? Maybe not. Yeah. Okay. I bring this up because this is an excellent segue into our next chapter, which is on consciousness. When it comes to consciousness, so consciousness is one of my favorite chapters. This is the chapter that we can have the most fun with, because this is really, it's quite literally where everything comes together. So what is consciousness? How would we define consciousness? So I'll tell you this, and just so that you don't feel like you're humiliating yourself or that you might get a wrong answer, I'll tell you this: no one has agreed on the definition of consciousness. You can get into a textbook and you can get into really high tier, debate among philosophers. Even the people who study consciousness, have not universally agreed on a singular definition. So, given that, how would you define consciousness? What is consciousness?
I feel like consciousness would be like when you're awake and alert.
Yeah, so that's a big component. It's that feeling like you're awake and alert, right? You kind of have something going on in front of you and you can be aware of it. Okay, good. That's one part of consciousness. What other aspects of consciousness are there? Or does anyone else have a different way of thinking about consciousness?
So if I'm correct, there's like a physical and mental part of it. Like as she had mentioned before, the mental part is a feeling of being awake, but a lot of people say it's like the actual state of being awake or your body like functioning.
Yes, right. Yeah, it's almost like I think I see what you're saying. There's almost like a physiological state of being awake, and that's one thing. You can kind of like see it, you can measure it. Your body gets aroused in a certain way. And then there's a separate part that's the actual experience. It's almost like that. It's the I would use the word subjective part of it. It's kind of that. It's that feeling that you have, right? That if you're listening to me and you're listening to my words right now, my words make sense to you. You understand generally what I'm saying, and that experience of understanding is part of your consciousness. So you have an experience of the words that I'm saying. Something like that, anyway.
Yeah, that's what I was going for.
Other aspects of consciousness, or other important elements of it. It is your awareness. It's your experience. Well, how about this? As we try to define consciousness, I usually find it helpful to think about this. Do non-human animals have consciousness? Dogs, cats, rats, ants, flies. Do non-human animals have consciousness? What do you think?
I would think so.
Why do you think that?
Because they go about and do their thing every day.
They do seem to, like us, go about and do their thing every day. Yeah. So, okay. So you can observe them. You can see that they do certain things that make it seem like they're conscious. So what are the things that other animals do that make it seem like they have consciousness?
Like when they feel like threatened or at risk, they'll either run or they might bite or and defend themselves.
Good. So they seem to have emotional reactions, right? Is if they're startled, they look surprised. If they're angry, they look angry. If they're sad, you see a sad dog, you know what that kind of looks like. If they're excited, their tail goes wagging. So it looks like they have these internal experiences, right? Okay. How else do you know? Is that all that we need for consciousness? What else would you need to be convinced that an animal is conscious? Because what that could be, let me give you an alternative. What that could be is they are simply responding like a machine to things that are happening around them. So let's say that you give them a piece of food. Their tail starts wagging. They look excited. Are they having a conscious experience? Or is that just the response that an animal has in response to getting treated? Just kind of like input output. So not only the stress, but it's other. Go ahead, Athena.
I say it is a type of consciousness because they are reacting to, getting treated and whatnot.
Yeah, Bree, what were you gonna say?
I was gonna say like whenever you're training them or whatever, like they're learning things as well though.
True. Why does that matter? Yeah,
Because they're learning and then like they remember stuff, so all you have to say is sit and they sit. Or lay down and they lay down.
True. There's something about learning that I think also seems like it's tied to consciousness, right? Especially if, say, someone or something has to make a decision, right? I think that's really a big part of consciousness for a lot of people, is if you can sit there and then you go, okay, I could eat a cookie right now, or I could put off eating a cookie so that I lose weight. Okay, I'm not going to eat a cookie. So it's like that internal experience of, okay, I have two options. I have two paths I can take. I'm going to take this one, right? It seems like when you learn something, what you realize is you have different options, right? Is I can sit here and be a good boy, and then I get treated, or I can just wander around and do whatever I want. It seems like in that situation, the animal is then saying, I choose to sit here, so I get treated.
I also learned in sociology class about subconscious, like that's not fully like aware and alert, but can influence like your feelings and the way you think.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree with that. I think that anyone who has ever been, whenever you get hungry, you realize that there is something going on beneath your awareness sometimes that influences your consciousness. When you are hungry, you're probably more irritable. You're probably less patient. You're probably paying less attention in class. Or if you're full, right? If you've just eaten a huge meal, you just had a big bowl of pasta, and then you try to go to class and listen, you realize that your conscious experience is being influenced by these subconscious experiences. You don't really necessarily feel everything that's going on in your stomach to help you digest food, but that act of digestion, of blood being in your internal or in your kind of central organs rather than out in the rest of your body or potentially in your brain, you feel the consequences of that subconscious, those subconscious processes. Yeah. Okay, so let's ask this. I guess what we're left with is we need to figure out what is required for an organism to have consciousness. So we've identified a few things: awareness, learning, perhaps, emotion and responsiveness, being able to make decisions, etc. I would say that each of these does contribute to constructing consciousness. I want to try and use the terms that we've been using: sensation and perception, associative learning, selective attention, neural networks, all this stuff. Can we use this terminology to help us define consciousness? If you had to use what you know from this class to define consciousness, how would you define it? Here's how I would define it. This is my working definition, and this is the definition that we're going to use for the rest of this class. It's very simple, it's very straightforward. It is the experience of all mental activity. So everything that we've learned about, your experience of sensation, of taking in that sensory information, of then making sense of it and organizing it to perceive it, you being able to direct your selective attention somewhere, your capacity to learn something and then store that thing in memory, neurons firing, etc., etc. Collectively, all of these things feed into your conscious experience. The argument here is that your consciousness is going to emerge. It is an emergent property of all the things happening in your nervous system at once. I think this does a good job of explaining what consciousness is, but also describing several aspects of it that I think make more sense when you define it this way. So that for the question, do non-human animals have consciousness? I personally would argue absolutely. Yes, of course they do. I couldn't imagine a situation where they wouldn't. But I wouldn't necessarily say that they have the same conscious experience as humans do. So yes, they have consciousness, but I think it might be in many ways different from our own. Now I want to say this as well. I don't think that it's inferior to our own either. I don't think that humans somehow have the pinnacle of consciousness, that we have the best consciousness or the most developed consciousness. I think, for example, so I'll give you some examples of this. Humans are superior to other animals in certain ways. That is, in terms, so every animal has a language, pretty much every animal, every social animal has some type of language, some way of communicating with other animals within their group or within their species. But humans go a step further, and we actually invented language. So we have a very, very complex set of tools for communicating. We actually have spoken and written language. So that's the way in which our consciousness might actually be superior. However, and I challenge you to do this, I should like show this video sometime. There's actually, there are many videos of ways that kind of researchers documenting ways in which other animals are capable of doing things that humans are not. So there's a really good video out there of they would give chimps and they gave humans the same task, where I don't know if you've ever seen this. It's like it's a matching task where you might have rows of things. So you have like individual objects or cards, okay? And you line up those cards or those objects in rows, and maybe have like 5 rows, okay? And on the side that you see, there's nothing printed, it's just blank. But if you were to flip them over, you see that there are pairs of objects that could be matched. So you could say, for example, turn one card over, turn the other card over, and they might match. So you show them what's on the other side for a couple of seconds, then you flip it back over and you say, okay, make as many matches as you possibly can. So you have to go through and you have to flip over a card, flip over another one. Ah, no, they didn't match. Hold on. I didn't remember that correctly. And then you flip over this one, you flip over that one. Oh, those do match. I did remember that correctly. So it's a test of memory. If you give this to humans and you give this to chimps, chimps do a phenomenal job. It's eerie how good they are at this. You give them this task where they have to flip these over and they get rewarded for it. They get a treat for it. You can show that to them for like a second. You can go, okay, here's everything. Okay, now find it. And what they do is they go, boom, this one goes with this one, this one goes with this one, this one goes with this one. Okay, done. Like 10 seconds flat. It's amazing. I'll try to find that video and send it out, but you can search for this. Probably chimpanzee number matching. I think they use numbers. So chimps, in certain ways, have a superior type of decision making, a superior type of consciousness compared to us. And the argument is that the kinds of things that chimps had to do versus the kinds of things that humans have had to do are different. And so we are going to be better at different things. So it's all a matter of how our nervous system works. It's a matter of what differences are there in the mental activity of a chimp versus the mental activity of a human, or whatever other animal we're talking about. This leads into what we're going to be talking about for the rest of this chapter, and that is altered states of consciousness. You may have heard this term before, an altered state of consciousness. Usually you hear it in reference to experiences that you might have while using a certain drug. But this very broadly describes any change in consciousness because you're changing something about the mental activity. So that is, if consciousness is your experience of all mental activity, what you could do is you could change something about your mental activity and thereby create a change in your conscious experience. I want to go through a few examples of this. One that you're probably all familiar with, daydreaming. Daydreaming is considered a type of altered state of consciousness. What this is, if you define it, it's when your selective attention drifts from an external task, something out here, to an internal personal experience. It makes sense that daydreaming is something that happens a lot when you're in class and you're listening to someone lecture, right? Right now, if you're listening to me, your selective attention is focused on an external task. I'm external to you, and you're listening to my words and you're trying to digest what I'm saying. As you're listening to me, though, you might get bored. I might start talking about something you're not really interested in, or maybe it's almost dinner time, or maybe you've got a hot date tonight. And so your attention drifts from me, the external task, to some kind of internal experience where you start to go, and you actually start to see it in your mind. You might like look up and you might start, drifting off, and you're like, man, yeah, this class is really interesting, but I'm having a date with that person that I haven't seen this entire time because we're on lockdown because of the pandemic, and they have their vaccine, I have my vaccine. I'm finally going to go out, I'm going to meet with them. Okay, and then it's going to be great. We're going to go out to dinner, and maybe we'll find like a movie, and then we might come back and, Netflix or something like that. And so you actually start to imagine that experience. You start to simulate it. You start to predict what that experience is going to be like, right? In that moment when you're daydreaming, when you're really immersed in a daydream, you are disconnected from the external world, right? Your conscious experience no longer reflects what's actually happening around you. Your mental activity is, your nervous system is not processing the world outside of you. Your nervous system is now processing kind of these stored memories that you have in your head. You're starting to simulate what it would be like to go out on a date with someone. What's going to happen later? That's daydreaming. So what you're altering here is whether your selective attention is focused on the external world, on the world out there, or whether it's focused on an internal world in here, in your memory. Okay, meditation. This is something that I love to talk about, and I want to go through. I think we have time for the example I want to do. I don't know what opinions you have about meditation. For a very long time, whenever someone would start talking about meditation, I would just kind of label it as bullshit. For a very long time, I thought meditation was bullshit. That it was something that people do, but they're just tricking themselves. I've actually changed my tone a little bit on this, and the reason is there actually is a very definitive, almost mechanical way of observing how meditation can affect your mind. So first, I want to define it. So meditation is, I mean, meditation's a lot of things. There are kinds of claims that people make about what meditation can do that are bullshit. They are untrue. However, if you really drill down into what meditation is, it is mental training. So it's a type of exercise. It's a training of a type that aims to improve attentional and emotional self-regulation. Now, self-regulation means if you regulate something, you control it. Not control it, but you try to work with it. You try to get it to work in the way that you want it to work. That's what regulation is. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to self-regulate your attention, what you're paying attention to, and the kind of emotions that you experience. So it's a mental training that aims to improve attentional or emotional self-regulation. Here's the premise. The idea here is that for most people, we tend to think that we have really good control over what we pay attention to, or maybe for some people we feel we have good control over our emotions, when in reality it's often we're often less capable than we think we are. So here's how I want to show how meditation works. If you have a piece of paper and a pencil, get that out. Or if you have something that you can kind of very easily, very quickly just kind of jot something down real quick, just make a little mark. Even if if you're on a computer, you could open up a notepad document or whatever. Just you need to be able to make distinct marks. Here's what I want to do. For about 3 minutes, we're going to sit in total silence. And the only thing that you're going to have to do, you have one task. As you're breathing in and out, I want you to only pay attention to your breath. That is, you cannot pay attention to anything else. You may only pay attention to your breath for 3 minutes. Every time that your attention drifts away from your breath, I want you to make a mark. I want to use that pencil, make a mark on the piece of paper or whatever. Okay? So that's your task. We'll sit here for 3 minutes in silence, focus on your breath. Every time your attention drifts from your breath, make a mark. And while we're doing it, close your eyes. All right, we'll start this now. I'll do it with you. 3 minutes, silence. Focus on your breath. Make a mark when you don't. Here we go. All right, how many marks do we have?
I got 6.
Like 10.
11.
Yeah, I got 9 this time. I'm usually better than that. I usually hover around 6. I must be really distracted. What this evidence is that even in 3 minutes, you get distracted between 6 and 11 times every 3 minutes. And usually it's probably stuff like, people are moving around you. So you pay attention to, you kind of, there's a loud noise and your attention just goes to that for just a second. Then maybe you can go back to your breath. The idea with meditation is that if you do this a lot, if you actually sit and you focus on your breath, and every time your attention drifts, you then push yourself back to try to think about your breath again. If you do that over and over and over again, you're going to get better at it. And so over time, you're going to get better at focusing on just one thing and tuning out everything else. That's what meditation is.
I do that a lot, especially when, like, say I have insomnia sometimes, and I'd be like, "What's up with me?" Sorry. Every now and then I'll get insomnia, and then I'll be like, "Okay, let's just quiet the mind, focus on breathing, and I'll eventually go to sleep." And that's how I got, like, that's why I only got 6.
Because
But
you've
it
done
also
this
doesn't help.
before. Yeah.
Yes. It also doesn't help much, but, every now and then, because it was only 3 minutes, I'd be like, I just had some cookies. Those were good. I want another one. Oh, focus on
Right.
breathing.
Right.
TV's on. Oh,
Exactly.
dog almost bit the kid. What?
Yeah, that's the big benefit that a lot of people report is that, so things like insomnia, things like, so you can't fall asleep, or things like you can't focus on a test, you can't focus on studying. Maybe you're in a social situation and you can't focus on what someone's saying. Often what can be causing that is maybe your attention, your mind really is going every which way. Part of that can be anxiety. Anxiety tends to be, when you experience anxiety, you're usually thinking about a lot of different stuff. The superpower of people with anxiety is that they tend to think things through a lot. They try to account for every possible thing that could go wrong. So of course your brain is going to go every which direction. The problem is that's a very unpleasant experience. And if you're trying to fall asleep, your mind going every which direction might actually keep you awake. So by meditating, by focusing on a breath, by essentially keeping your attention focused on just one thing, what happens is you stop thinking about all those other things. So it kind of quiets down all that, where your mind is drifting. And if you're just focusing on one thing, you tend to be much more relaxed, much more calm. So that's the idea here. If anyone does struggle with anxiety or struggle with focusing on a test, focusing on studying, I actually recommend meditation. Just try it out. There's really no harm to it. If you do it enough, if you make it practice, just like physical exercise, do it a little bit every day. You don't have to do it a lot. People do tend to experience a much better job being able to focus. Yeah. And it's usually calming for a lot of people. Here's your life hack for the day. Okay. So, there's your exclusive thinking about breath. All right, with the 2 minutes we have left, what I want to do is I want to describe what hypnosis is. Hypnosis is also one of those things that you probably look at and go, that's bullshit. There's a lot about hypnosis that is untrue. There are things that you've probably heard that are not true. Here's what hypnosis is. So what the part of it that is real. Hypnosis is simply relaxation, intense concentration, and focused attention. If you have ever been in a conversation with someone and you're talking about something that's really interesting to you, that you absolutely love, and the time flies, you're like, oh my God, it's 2 hours later, where'd things go? In that moment, while you were talking, you were hypnotized because you were relaxed, you were intensely concentrated on what you were talking about, and your attention was given entirely to that other person. If you read a really good online article and you get lost in it, you wake up an hour later, you're like, oh my God, where'd it go? You were hypnotized. If you're listening to an interesting lecture, if you have ever found yourself listening to me and you're like, oh my God, it's 2:15 already, chances are I had you hypnotized. It's nothing special. What's that?
Sorry. I was gonna say, what about playing a video game? I'd be lost in a video game. Next thing I know, it's 5 hours later. I was like, what?
Absolutely. That's it. You're relaxed, you're focused, and all your intensely concentration, your concentration is entirely on that game. That is a type of hypnosis, right? We pay for hypnosis. We buy video games to hypnotize us. That is what it is. That's what it is at its most basic level. The other stuff, which they make claims, I'm going to kind of zoom through this since we don't have much time. I'll say this, it's not mind control. So that is, if you are hypnotized, you're not going to be doing things against your own will. That is a misnomer. So with like Ka in the Jungle Book, it doesn't cause someone to do something that they would be against doing. But what it can do is it can make you more suggestible. That means you're going to be more willing to do something that you otherwise wouldn't do. And that's actually its main clinical use, is that it helps people calm down. It helps people to do things that otherwise they'd be too nervous or too jittery to do. It's also not what's called a behavior cessation aid. There's a lot of people out there who will try to sell you hypnosis as a method for stopping smoking or stopping some other thing that you don't want to be doing. I'll say this, we know it doesn't work. There have been double-blind, placebo-controlled, experimental, longitudinal studies examining this. And what we find is that if you put people, if you randomly assign people to two groups, one where they're given hypnosis, as say for quitting smoking, where they're given a hypnosis file to help them quit smoking, and the other is a control group where they get nothing. What you find is that in the short term, people go, wow, this really helped, I don't want to smoke. But if you follow them a year later, they're just as likely to be smoking as the control group. So as a long-term behavior cessation just means stopping, behavior cessation aid, hypnosis seems not to work. So that is what hypnosis is not. All right, here's what we're going to do this week. Everything is posted. This first week, we're going to talk about sleep. And we're going to be looking at sleep as an altered state of consciousness. How does your perception, how does your consciousness change when you're sleepy or asleep? In the following week, we're going to talk about drug use. How do drugs change your perception? All right, so that's what we have planned. Remember research participation. Remember, you should have turned in hypothesis number 4 today. Otherwise, stay on task. And if there are no questions, I will see you next week. Any questions?
I have something.
Yes.
So for my research proposal 4, I gotten the idea of, since pets are commonly like used as like stress relief. Well, the idea kicked into me. It's like, well, what about people who have no pet? Like, I know if people don't have any pets, but what about somebody who has a pet, like a dog, outside chained up, which is a sad reality. But they don't have the same like de-stressifying moments of like coming home from a hard day's work, and normally you will have a dog greeting you at the door, but if it's an outside backyard dog, that's not the same like effect. So I kind of wrote that in my fourth hypothesis, but I think I might want to revamp that.
I think that's a great one. What I would predict, so if you wrote this correctly, what I would guess is that you would have predicted that people who keep their dogs inside will experience less anxiety than people who keep their dog outside. And the idea is that if the interaction with the pet lowers anxiety, then whether your pet is inside or outside should be the independent variable. And the amount of anxiety that a person feels, or however you want to measure that, should be the dependent variable.
Yeah, I think I might want to like rewrite it if that's possible. Like,
Of course,
for
yeah.
my hypothesis 5, I should like revamp it or like reword it. Is that fine?
That's totally fine. So I'll grade it as it was submitted. But what you can always do is if you want to write your second research proposal about it, absolutely you can change it. Yeah.
Okay, that's all I need.
Cool. All right, everybody. Thanks for sticking around. Jeez, I take that as a great compliment. All right, get out of here. Thank you for being here. I'll see y'all next week. Take care.